Yeah, thank you all for joining. I'd like to introduce our two speakers today, Komei Dempster and Brynn Saito. So Bryan is an award-winning poet, editor, and poet, editor, and teacher. His volumes of poetry, Seas and Topaz, have received several honors, including the Julie Suk Award and NCPA Gold Award in Poetry, and a Human Relations Indie Book Silver Winner Award. He is the editor of From Our Side of the Fence, Growing Up in America's Concentration Camps, which received a Nisei Voices Award from the National Japanese American Historical Society, and Making Home from War, Stories of Japanese American Exile and Resettlement. Bryan is a professor of rhetoric and language and director of administration for the Masters in Asia Pacific Studies program at the University of San Francisco, where he received the Distinguished Teaching Award. In addition, he teaches for the Colrain Poetry Manuscript Conference. Brynn Saito is a poet, organizer, and assistant professor of creative writing and English at California State University in Fresno. She is the author of two books of poetry, Power Made a Spoon and The Palace of Contemplating Departure, winner of the Benjamin Saltman Award from Red Hen Press, and a finalist in the Northern California Book Award. Brynn is a two-time recipient of the California State Library Civil Liberties Public Education Grant for her work with Yonsei Memory Project, or YMP. Co-founded with the farmer and artist Mikiko Matsumoto, YMP uses art and storytelling to connect the World War II era incarceration of Japanese American community with current struggles for justice. In 2019, Brynn was featured in Vogue magazine for her work with YMP and has received support from Densho, Hedgebrook, and Santa Fe Art Institute's Truth and Reconciliation program. Her poetry has appeared in the New York Times and American Poetry Review, and was featured in the opening ceremony for the People's Inauguration, a 10-day event inspiring collective action led by activist Valerie Carr. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bryan and Brynn.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you, Joy. And I'll just say a few words before I hand it off to my poet sister friend here. But we're really happy to be with you all today. Big gratitude to the Japanese American National Museum, Joy and Elizabeth who made this happen, and Maria who helped with ordering the books. And I see family and friends in the audience. It's great to have you here with us today. And just to tell you what we're going to do, we want you to be ready to type things in the chat, because Brynn and I have made this an interactive type of presentation. And what we're going to be doing is a combination of a poetry reading with conversation and some questions for you to ponder that relate to the themes of the poetry that we're going to read. And the main themes are quest for inheritance, convergences, remembrance, and agency and empowerment. So I'm really excited to, be doing this with Brynn, because she and I have become close friends, and I consider her like a family member. She's also a very gifted poet. So this is a very special event for me. And Brynn, I'm going to hand it off to you for any opening remarks before I put on the slideshow.
Well, not much to add to that, Bryan, other than just very happy to be here, and thank you to Janum for having us, and thank you all for being here today. And I think we're going to dive in. Bryan and I have orchestrated a little, I think, a very thoughtful presentation and interactive. So excited to share that with you.
Okay, thanks, Brynn. So we're going to move into a slideshow, and let me go back a few slides here. Okay. So I'm just doing a few Zoom adjustments. So art, identity, and legacy, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Again, our big thanks to Janum. I also want to give a shout out to my Four Way Books team. They're an amazing publisher. I'm so grateful to have them: Martha, Sally, Ryan, Hannah, and Bridget. And I'll let you say a few words about Red Hen, Brynn. I know you've had a great experience with them.
Yeah, just thanks to Red Hen, especially Mark and Kate Gale. And Red Hen will be publishing my third book in fall of 2023. So excited about that.
Yeah, you all need to be on the lookout for that book. I've read it and it's dynamite.
Mm.
So here's our first question. And all of you in the audience with us today, including you, Mom and Dad, we would love for you to type into the chat any answers that you have to this first question. So we're looking at this idea of the quest for inheritance. Brynn and I are very interested in this as Sansei and Yonsei, third and fourth generation Japanese Americans. So if you all could type in the chat, what camps were you or your family members or other people you know imprisoned in? And if you don't know anyone who is directly imprisoned in the camps, that's fine. But maybe you've heard of others who were, and you can put that in the chat. So we're going to look in the chat because we're really interested to get your context as we dive into our first two poems. Heart Mountain. Oh yeah, Brynn, you put yours. Jerome, Roar, Gila River. So same as Brynn's grandparents. Yeah. And I'll just say, my mother was in Topaz. My grandfather and them reunited in Crystal City, and he was in all these DOJ camps. Manzanar, Poston, Gila River. Manzanar. It's almost like a mantra to say the names.
Mm.
Oh, Patricia's here with us. Hey, Patricia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow, Brynn, it basically spans the entire United States and many of the WRA camps. And Patricia looks like she's eating some popcorn. Okay, that's great. Yeah. Okay, that's very helpful. So really a diverse in terms of geography, demographics, origin, stories, backgrounds. And this is what I feel has been a big concern of my poetry. And my first book, Topaz, which many of you in the audience know, is named after the concentration camp in Utah. This is the cover of that book. And really the book is about the speaker's quest to uncover a past that has been silenced, that has been given in fragments, that has been spoken about by some of the family members, but withheld by others. It's about this really delicate balance of trying to get the story from your ancestors and your family members, but also being respectful of those silences because of how traumatic it is to talk about the camp experience. So that cover is actually of a grave where dogs were buried in one of the camps, believe it or not. This is my grandfather, Oji-chan. And incidentally, he has some scrolls of calligraphy that were donated to the Japanese American National Museum. He was a master calligrapher. He's obviously a Buddhist priest. And he, like many other Issei and community leaders, was interned in Department of Justice camps before the rest of the family was taken away. And, he was in Missoula, Montana, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Livingston, Louisiana, and many years later was finally reunited with his family in Crystal City, Texas. And there he is in his priest garb called a kesa. This is my grandmother Obachan, and she was actually a haiku poet and really, in a way, a connoisseur and practitioner of some of the Japanese arts. And that's evident from this photo. She and my grandfather actually ran the Nichiren Buddhist Church of America. And I was a caretaker there for about 10 years. And while I was a caretaker there, I wrote the book Topaz and finished it. And this first poem is about this idea of living as a caretaker in this space that felt haunted and inhabited by the ghost of the past. This is the church where my grandparents were taken away, where my mother as a baby was taken away, my aunts and uncles were forcibly removed. And so living in that space had a lot of meaning and relevance. So the first poem I'm going to read is the second poem in the book Topaz, and it's about the quest for inheritance. The speaker is driving across the Utah desert and towards San Francisco. And as the speaker is driving, begins to imagine Topaz. What was it like? What is that legacy? The poem is called Crossing. No turning back. Deep in the Utah desert now, having left one home to return to the temple of my grandfather. I press the pedal hard. Long behind me, civilization's last sign, a bent post and a wooden board. No food or gas for 200 miles. The tank needling below half full. I smoke Camels to soothe my worry. Is this where it happened? What's left out there of Topaz in the simmering heat? On quartz asphalt, I rush past salt beds, squint at the horizon for the desert's edge. A lone tower, a flattened barrack, some sign of Topaz, the camp where my mother, her family were imprisoned. As I speed by shrub cactus, the thought of it feels too near, too close. The engine steams, the radiator hisses, gusts gather, wind pushes my Civic side to side, and I grip the steering wheel, strain to see through a windshield smeared with yellow jacket wings, blood of mosquitoes. If I can find it, how much can I really know? Were sandstorms soft as dreams or stinging like nettles? Who held my mother when the wind whipped beige handfuls at her baby cheeks? Was the sand tinged with beige or orange from oxidized mesas? I don't remember my mother's answer to everything. High on coffee and nicotine, I half dream in waves of heat. Summon ghosts from the canyon beyond thin lines of barbed wire. Our name, Ishida. Ishi means stone, Da, the field. We were gemstones strewn in the wasteland. Only 3 days and 1,000 miles to go before I reach San Francisco, the church where my mother was born and torn away. Maybe Topaz in the desert was long gone, but it lingered in letters, photos, fragments of stories. My mother's room, now mine, the bed pulled blank with iron sheets, a desk set with pen and paper. Here I would come to understand.
Beautiful poem, Brian.
Thank you, my friend. And I now want to hear your own quest for inheritance in this poem for your dad.
Yeah, I love that line in your poem, how much can we know? And I think those same desires and that same questioning that drove you in a Civic. I also drove a Civic.
Yeah, did you?
Yeah, I never caught that before in your poem, but my dad and I took my Honda Civic and we drove to Arizona to Gila River to visit, the camps, and
Yeah.
because they're on the lands, ancestral lands of the Gila River Indian community. We requested permission, and we had 2 guides who generously guided us around the land, and out of respect also for the Gila River Indian community, we weren't able to take and share photographs publicly. So I had a student who's an artist draw this sketch based on the photograph I took of my dad in front of the Gila River Monument. And I think my dad's listening here with us today. So always very special to share this story when he's in the room with us. So I thought I'd read for you all a letter I wrote to my dad after we returned from that that pilgrimage. And Brynn, if you go to the next slide, I believe the next slide has a picture of my dad's garden in Fresno. And the letter references the garden. And so I thought we could have this showing while I read it. So my dad over the years has sort of built this and attended to this beautiful backyard garden where I grew up. So this is called Letter to My Father. Dear Dad, there's a new way I see the garden now, the one you've been tending for decades on Garden Avenue, of all names, the street of our family home. In haiku written by camp prisoners, days and seasons are tracked by the falling leaves of the moss rose petal to earth. Poets in camp numbered months and years by the memory of their home gardens left behind on the West Coast, flowering rhododendrons and peony buds they imagined as vibrant, stalks remaining firm. I think of us traveling that week in the summer of 2019, all away from California, along the train's course, through Arizona and on to Gila River. How far I brought you from your garden. Did you think of the sagos, the summer tomatoes and basils, the azaleas and red maples, the night blooming lantana, trees needing trimming, grass going brown, all of the work awaiting you? Did you imagine the dogs chirping and the silent white bucket and Mom dragging the hose across the lawn to wake the fountain? Here in the Southwest, I find myself pining for the great Central Valley, as I did when I lived in New York, or that decade by the bay, exhausted from cold bridges and colder waters, longing with my entire body for the landscapes of childhood's kingdom, smog dust and all. I understand now I am nothing. I'm the daughter of a living father, blessed to be returning to you after our fire and ice travels through North American landscapes, spotted by our elders' lives, their prison, desert homes, and other jails and prisons, with and without bars or barbed wire. You were not taken. In the night and shirtless, you were not captured or broken by the sentry's light, despite my nightmares. You took your time in the summer garden, where Lee and I played as the light set, basiling our bodies against mosquitoes, baking mud sweets in California's sugary dusk. Dad, your voice is wise now beyond kindness. I'll see you soon. So that's my letter to my dad after our journey to Gila River.
Such a moving poem and so well read by you. And I love this idea of the direct address to dad. And I love the idea of the garden and what it represents in contrast to the arid starkness of camps and all that color and life and vitality, right? It's so metaphorical, right? As to, you know, looking at that versus like a picture of the dusty, barren barracks. So I love how you create that contrast and juxtaposition in that gorgeous poem. It's so moving.
Thank you, Brynn.
Yeah. So we're going to move to our next theme. Take one last look at the garden. Great job, Brynn's dad. That's a lovely garden. So for those of you, I saw some people have just joined us. What we're doing is we're doing 4 themes today and 4 questions. This is question number 2 for you in the audience. And so Brynn and I Brynn, do you want to go ahead and share this question? Convergences? Yeah.
Sure. I think a lot of, the work we do in Yonsei Memory Project is thinking about, how the legacy of camp relates to other other struggles for justice, how these patterns of detention, incarceration, being forcibly removed from lands, these are old themes that sort of resonate through many cultures and many communities. And so I think just with everything going on today, with the rise in anti-Asian violence, and thinking about reparations for the Black American community, what are the different connections that the story of the Japanese American experience has with other stories. So we thought maybe we can name some of those in the chat. We invite you to just pop in whatever comes to your mind when you're thinking about other issues and themes and subjects that connect or are related to sort of the camp story. So that's our opening question, and I'll pass it back to you, Brian.
Yeah, so we're just going to honor this question for a few moments. And if you feel so compelled, we'd love to hear your own spiritual, emotional, personal connections to this theme. And, for me, it has to do with disability and my son's seizures. I'm going to read a poem about that momentarily. But we are curious, and it might be a question that takes some thought and reflection. So it's no worries. We're just going to give it a few moments, see if anyone has any thoughts. These are existential questions. By the way, this is not a test. There are no wrong answers. Okay. Everyone's worried, Brynn and Brian are going to grade our answers.
So I'll pop a couple that I mentioned.
Yeah, I'm going to put in mine too. Oh, yeah, Patty. Ownership of memory. That's a really good point. Stewardship of land and stories. Yeah. Yeah. And as Brynn had mentioned, right, some of the camps are on Native American lands. That's such a complicated dynamic. And then this idea of like creativity and what stories do we have the right and ownership to, and of what stories can we tell, and how do we honor the voices of other perspectives without appropriating, is how I think of Patty's important question. Okay. Civil rights struggles across multiracial communities. Yeah, breaking silences around trauma for sure. Yeah.
Oh, those are great.
Perpetual other, foreigner, not American, justice in the Constitution, inequality. Yeah, these are the kind of things Brynn and I talk about all the time, and the work we're interested in doing. Yonsei Memory Project, of course, is centering around these things. Leadership. Yeah. Thanks, Patty. I agree. I don't know, Brynn, anything else you want to add to these comments before we go to our poems?
Those are great. I think it sets it up beautifully. Go ahead, Brian.
Okay. I'm going to add mine to the chat. Thanks, you all. Those are really powerful and important connections and resonances. And really, part of today is just getting us to think about what is the larger symbolic and metaphorical nature of the incarceration that we've held for so many decades now in our community, right? So I'm going to share with you a poem that I think, this is my mother's painting. Sui Ren is her artist name. Her actual name is Renko. She's here in the audience, and it's an amazing painting that she did that we chose for the cover. And I think just letting it sink in, you can feel the sense of a epileptic seizure. You might see blood or fire. You might see a forest. You might see snow. And all these things are, convergences in the book Seas. This is a picture of my son and I, and this is when I was a little younger, and so was he, and he could sit on my lap. And this is before he was diagnosed. And we're just sitting at our family cabin, enjoying the view. And this is him after he's had a bout of seizures in the hospital, recovering in his gown. And another painting by my mother. I think this painting by my mother, the reason I like it is it resonates with the line above, a searing of gray or glitter of stars veiled by fog. And sometimes I think, going back to what Patricia and others were saying in the chat, I think that trauma and silence has this sense of opaqueness and obscurity, and the past and reality is swirling behind it and within it. But then there's the whiteness of the clarity around the trauma, and that's kind of radiating outward from that. And this also reminds me of what a brain, sort of the feeling of having a seizure might feel like, right? That painting too. So this poem, Seized, from my second book, Seized, all you need to know is that the two main characters that are represented are Brendan, my son here, and his journey vis-a-vis epilepsy. And then my mother, Renko, who, as I mentioned before, was incarcerated as a young child, and what her family went through and those convergences. Seized. By day, by night, in handcuffs, through mind scramble, brain surge, shock of force, body taut, alerted, taken, outside, inside, anytime, any place, no words to explain. My infant mother, 1942, my young son now. The rug, his twisted body, his world inside, and what it does. Red flare or white lightning, fried impulse or smoldering heat. A searing of gray or glitter of stars veiled by fog. Her fragments, yellow orb, the porch light. Shimmer against her face, the cradle, her mother's arms. A blanket's false cover, itch of wool, hives on skin. Things just happen, by bus, by train, in war, electric storms, a horse stable, desert, sand swirl and mind gust, thought cloudings, word mountains spike against white, a guard's boot, trodden syllable, a thorned cage, wing pierced, baby hawk in wire, my barbed string of words to capture him, capture her. If he never speaks, I carry him. If she cries for her father, grandmother carries her. Someplace, my mother carries what is unremembered, begins to know when I ask. I don't speak of things I can't know, of despair about my son. We never know where we are going, where love will end us.
That poem, Brian, that poem is so good. I'm like, it's like I want to laugh and cry all at once. I just feel so moved by that poem every time I hear it. Just the way you're collaging and listing, but in doing that, you're making these comparisons between the experiences of your mother and your son, and creating that, again, that intergenerational connection that trauma makes, but also love is on that. Love is intergenerational too, and stunning.
Thank you so much, friend. And for those of you in the audience who are art makers and writers and whatever form that you work in, I think Brynn's point is important, right? Like, what are those metaphors or images or juxtapositions that can enact the themes that you guys dropped into the chat about trauma and about breaking silence. For me, you know, it was organically discovered as I wrote the poem, those connections. It was not pre-planned. And I think that happens to us sometimes as artists. But discovering those convergences was very valuable to me because it allowed me to kind of make sense of both things, what happened to my son, what happened to my mother. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Brynn, and this is your poem about convergence. I'm really excited to hear it. And this is from your upcoming book, right?
Mhm.
That's going to be published. Okay.
Yeah, so similar to your poem, there's this grasping for a language, I think, in this prayer poem, seeking a language. There's a fragmentation to this poem. I wrote this poem right on the heels of the mass shooting that happened in Atlanta, Georgia, which we just had the anniversary of that mass shooting. And I think I was just feeling very rattled, and maybe like a lot of you have felt, those of us in the Asian American and Asian community who have felt more targeted, you know, in this heightened time, and afraid for our elders. And some of those themes are in this prayer poem. And I put these images of Mayumi Oda's work in here because you can see the Earthship painting actually is hanging in my, the print is actually hanging in my room behind me, but these pieces that she's done around goddesses and gardens and landscapes, sort of this balm to me, and sort of almost I felt like I was praying to these goddesses, praying to these higher powers during that time to help me make sense, you know, of what was going on, and make sense of my own fear I was feeling as an Asian American woman walking through the world. And so those poems are the poems kind of drawing on all that and kind of trying to find a language for that fear that was trembling through my body. So this is prayer for a trembling body. Queen of adrenaline, come to me with your clear wings and wake me a language. Queen of the breathless season of shelter, I'm swelling with blossoms in the great Central Valley. I'm trying to have a child and raging for a sign. I'm pressing my luck against Trump flags, flapping over black trucks, sunrise piercing the Sierras. Dear daughter of unbarracked deserts and trauma, dear queen of cerebrum and spinal cord seas, we survived, says my mother. No grocery store murder, no white power virus. Tell me why are we only made visible by violence? We are aloe in the long leaves of the childhood garden. We are undammed free waters, rivering grief. Queen of the blood-brain barrier burning, daughter of scapegoat expressive depression, it's night in the sweat bed. In one dream, all the swords with their skull handles pierce the snow stag. In another, I float happy and unclothed under gnarled oak and lotus, dear radical ancestor, I am eating their language. Help me set down my husband's gun and unstitch my eyes. Show me post-memory ghosts in the name of new justice. Bring me sister mouth refuge in the moon-washed, dog-snarled, irreversible night.
Wow. Such a powerful poem. I really like the I am, then later moves into we are, and this movement from like a singular to a collective. And I think that's so appropriate for convergence. And then addressing this idea of the daughter as if the daughter could be both the speaker looking at herself, but it could also be this kind of more mythic idea of the daughter. And I also love the lyrical up against the kind of harsh reality of the world, like the Trump flags and sort of, you know, I love how there's so many tonalities and registers emotionally and lyrically and imagistically in that poem. And, you know, one thing Brynn and I had talked about before this event is kind of like forms of faith or forms of art And the idea of a prayer, I think Brynn really, it sounds like a prayer, right? That poem. And I know for me, the sutra in the Buddhist tradition was also helpful to write my work. So all of you in the audience, we want you to think about, like, what are the vessels and containers and even forms of your own culture and experience that you can honor and use in your art, whether you're a painter or a writer or a craftsperson or whatever it is that you do in your music. What are those cultural, you know, I guess traditions and things that you can honor? I think Brynn's poem does that well. So audience, we hope you're all with us. We can feel your good spirit and energy here today. And the next thing Brynn and I wanted you to put into the chat, this is our third theme. DOR was on February 19th, as you all know, only a month ago today, yes? And we think that in our own poems, in our art, remembrance is such a task. It's one that has great responsibility and one that we take seriously. But then we all have our ways of remembering people. It's not just through poems. And we'd like to hear from you. How do we perform remembrance for those we have lost? Do you have a little altar in your house that you sit and put fruit inside a gold bowl for your ancestors? Do you write poetry? Please drop in the chat how you perform remembrance. And it could be just meditating upon and thinking of your loved ones. And Brynn, I'm going to let you read from the chat. I don't know. It's disappeared on my screen.
Okay. Well, I'll add a couple that
Oh, there it is. It reappeared.
Okay, great. Making art, visiting the cemetery, visiting special places. What else do we think about? Where do we go to remember those we've lost? How do we honor them?
Yeah, I'm with you. Poetry in place for sure. Poetry in place. Can even be rituals you do. I would say burning incense at my grandfather's temple was associated with me about remembrance, especially at certain services. Gail said my dad was a maker, always puttering in the garage. Oh, that's really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So Gail has that connection to the garage, sense of place. Yeah. Actually, that's a great point, Gail. It's like when you're in the car sometimes and a certain song comes on and it transports you into a memory. Yeah, place can do that as well, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the garden comes back from Joaquin. So that's like, yeah, I love that, the idea of growing a garden. Yeah, my contemplation of the past and how it affected the present. Patricia, yeah, photos, asking family members, engaging in dialogue, and then telling your children those stories, passing down the lineage. Food, yeah. Brynn and I can relate to that. When Brynn and I go out to lunch, we always have like Japanese food, right, Brynn?
We're honoring our ancestors. Yes.
Of course, Brynn is also half Korean, so we okay.
Either cuisine works.
And I'm half European American, so no. Okay. Oh, in Hawaii, we rinse out the mayonnaise glass jars. Oh, I didn't know that. That is really beautiful.
Yeah, these are great.
Replace the flowers. Yeah, so the poet in me thinks these are all great poems you could write. These versions, like the mayonnaise glass jars and replacing the flowers, is a poem. Food is a poem. Our ancestors and photos, those are poems. But make your own version of remembrances. I love that you do it within the everyday, like it's part of the ritual of life. I love that. Well, thank you for your wonderful answers. So one thing I want to say about Brynn and I's work, and Brynn will share a poem as well on this theme, is that We also want to make connections of remembrance to things beyond just the Japanese American experience. And that's to actually, in fact, deepen and extend the implications of our own cultural experiences. For me, there's certain things that have always haunted me when they happened. And I think it's because they resonate with what has happened to our community, the Japanese American community. One of those things is Matthew Shepard, who was tragically and brutally murdered in Laramie, Wyoming in 1998. And, I'm not going to go into the whole story, but essentially based on his sexuality, he was targeted, he was, manipulated. And there's quite a few plays and documentaries about this story. And, it always resonated with me. And so I finally wrote a poem about it. And, speaking of Brynn's idea of prayer for a trembling body, this is the tradition of the Psalm. And the Psalm helped me think about it. Also, the fact that his name is Matthew Shepard, right, resonated with the idea of spirituality and prayer. And this is really for Matthew Shepard. And I guess as you listen to it, I just want you to think about the ways in which this is performing remembrance and maybe other remembrances you think of. And that's my mom's painting that I think is appropriate for the images in the poem. It's called Shepherd's Psalm after Psalm 23. And Psalm 23 is very famous. Prepare for enemies, warm your feet from dirt's grave cold, uncover your voice, the words flying out like leaves into gusts of their rage. Dissolve the fist stain on your face and the rope around your wrists. Lie down in the beaten dark, near pastures green and unbruised, the salt raining down your blood, restoring dusk's ragged edge to smooth plains of terracotta slate, your gold straw hair igniting the wick of pink dawn. You shall not want.
Stunning images in that poem, Brian. And I love how you're sort of using the poem to think about, imagine into these other struggles, these other identities. I think your book does that in kind of wonderful ways. It's not just thinking about racial violence, it's thinking about gendered violence, it's thinking about patriarchy. It's kind of making connections between all those isms that swirl around us. So thank you.
Thank you. And I really look forward to hearing your remembrance.
Yeah, so this for this theme of remembrance, I'll read a short poem that is in honor of Day of Remembrance, February 19th, which in 1942 was the day that executive order was signed. The executive order was signed that authorized the camps. And this poem is addressed to or written about my grandmother, Alma, who's there on the left, and that's my grandfather. And the both of them actually met in Gila River when they were incarcerated in their early 20s. So there they are. And so this poem is called February 19th, 1942. Moon across the sky in the purple morning, dry earth unfurling. In another California, my grandmother is packing everything she owns into one suitcase, 2 suitcases, the water still in the clay pitcher, water unwasted, only what she can carry. There is no moment in my life in which this is not happening. What is happiness? 2 granddaughters in a summer garden, firstborn, secondborn, and grandmother laughing. There is no moment in which she is not alive and rising, imbuing these hills, this morning sky with shadows.
Goosebumps. You know, Brynn, when we put this program together, I didn't know how the ending of that poem would resonate with the Shepard psalm, the idea of the sky, like the imbuing the sky in the pink dawn. And this idea of remembrance is the figure kind of blending into something larger, into the landscape, into this more, you know, sort of intangible space. And it always gets me, your line about, and I'm paraphrasing, you know, there is no moment in my life in which this is not happening. That always gets me. And I think all of you with us here today could probably all resonate that there is something embedded in us that even if it's historically distant 70 years ago, that it's present. And that's how trauma works. That's how history works. That's how ancestry works. And I think that emotional import really comes across in the poem. You make the past so alive and so present through the way that you vividly describe the family figure. It's just really, really powerful. So anyway, wow, we are now turning to our last theme, and think about the arc, the legacy and inheritance of the past, the idea of convergence and what we put together. How do we relate the camp experience to other things? And we're moving into this idea of remembrance. To me, is an empowering act, even if it's sad and tender and difficult. It's empowering. But we want to move fully into the idea of agency and empowerment. And how do you inherit trauma and silences and difficult experiences, many of which you dropped in the chat earlier? How do you move towards agency and empowerment? I think it's a really important question for us to ask. And so I'm going to hand it off to my sister here to kind of share the question with you. And we want to give you a few moments to reflect and write some answers in the chat. So I'm going to move to the final theme here. So Brynn.
Yeah, so this question is pretty simple. Like, what artists and writers inspire you to live fully, to connect, just to kind of get us thinking about the role that art and books and literature play in helping us, you know, process or envision new realities, or just make a space to feel. I guess in this, you know, I think I've been thinking a lot about your own work, Brian. I might name you, folks like Brandon, who I'm going to talk about later, folks who are here today, like Patricia and Nikiko Masumoto, who, you know, we work on Yonsei Memory Project together. So many amazing Yonsei and Gosei artists, but just like, you know, like what are the songs and books that you've turned to that bring you that comfort, make you feel alive? And it doesn't have to be related to camp or Japanese American artists. It can be anything. What comes to you, Brian, for that question?
Well, Brynn, you do. Yeah. And yeah, like you said, some of our colleagues and friends like Brandon and Todd and Mia, but also, you know, Garrett Hongo and Lee Young Lee and Wakako Yamauchi and Hisai Yamamoto. And, you know, that's in the immediate sense of the Japanese American community, David Murrah. But yeah, I would go into jazz artists and hip hop artists. And, you know, my dad, Stuart, is an amazing musician. My mother, Renko, a painter. My brother, a cellist. Nikiko too. Yeah, like, you know, the stuff we've done together. So anyway, you all should drop in the chat. Don't be shy. It can be like, you know, Tupac Shakur. It can be, you know, Brynn Saito. Like, I'm sure, right? You're all fans after hearing today. You probably already were. PJ Hirabayashi. Yeah.
Musical artist. Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you, Gail. And Gail's, told us about the garage, right? I think that was Gail. Yeah, other artists. Nina Ravoya. Ah, okay, I'm going to start writing some of these names down. Yeah, and Joy and Elizabeth, if you can save the chat, this is going to be a really great chat to have, actually. We would appreciate it. Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, Japanese American National Museum, they have some amazing artists for you to think about, if some of you have been to the museum. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dan. So maybe Dan's giving us a shout out. Thank you, Dan. I super appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll just wait a few more minutes, a few more seconds, a few more moments. Okay. Well, what I'm going to say before I move to my poem is buy all of Brynn's books. She's amazing. And her third book's going to be incredible. So, Brynn, when is that coming out exactly?
Fall 2023. So a little ways off, but
Okay.
it feels close. Yeah. I'm getting nervous.
Oh, I see James Baldwin and Bell Hooks in there. Thanks, Joaquin. Yeah. Baldwin's amazing. The Fire Next Time. And we can learn so much from Bell Hooks as teachers, as activists, as artists. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all. We appreciate it. So, I think for me, what I would say in both of my books, Topaz and Seas, is that I tried to create an arc that in some ways reflects what we've talked about today. And I tried to get the closing sections. I mean, Topaz doesn't have sections, but the latter part of the book and Seas, the last section, to reflect the idea of agency and empowerment, like a movement towards some kind of resolution. So I'm going to wave to my mom. Mom, what's up? It's so good to see you. Yeah. So this is my mother. And she's really, I think her smile and her radiance there is really indicative of who she is. And she's with my boy, Brendan, her grandson. And this picture just breaks my heart every time. And I think it goes well with this final poem I'm going to read for you today, which for me is one of agency empowerment. And it's in my mother's voice. And just keep in mind that my mother swears that she heard him say a word, and I'm going to tell you what that word is in the poem. And he is nonverbal, so this is a very significant event. So the poem, My Mother Watches Horses with Brendan, in my mother's voice. Through the fence you look out, their hooves breaking new earth. Sleek fur, the shade of bourbon, kicking up clods of green. I wheel you closer to shaken ground. Grandson, at 10 years old, you pointed them. Once, I thought you said the word horse. Someday I'll paint you the story. Topaz rain galloped over roofs, barracks thundered. We were the ones corralled. My hand's on your shoulders, your hand taps my wrist. Look, they are flying over crests of hills, running into the sky. Go far enough. Speak what you can. There's love in silence. All things, they come and go.
Beautiful. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. And thank you to my mother for inspiring that poem. And
yeah, what a beautiful poem.
yeah.
Love, yeah, there's the love and silence. And yeah, I think your poem, it's stretching into the future and into the past. And I think the letter, the last letter I'm going to read, sort of does that as well. And This is a letter that's part of the Dear Project, which is an online archive of letters that begins with the letter I wrote to my dad, who's right there pictured in the middle, and our exchange after visiting Gila River. And the archives sort of expanded to include letters I wrote to my mom and to my fellow activists and my sister. And if you go one more slide, you'll see some more people that exchanged in the letters with me. So with Nisei and Sansei and Yonsei, and also folks from other communities. So I use these letters as a way to kind of make sense of that trip I did with my dad to Gila, and also to touch on those convergences that we spoke about before. And if you go to one more slide, you'll see Brandon Shimoda right there in the middle. We have to get, so my husband did these beautiful black and white portrait photos of my friends and community members, and we have yet to get one from Brandon. So Brandon sent me in that shot of himself. So this last piece I'm going to read is the letter I wrote to Brandon after I visited Gila River, and then Brandon wrote me back. And what I can do is I can put in the chat here our exchange, so you can both read along if you'd like, or you can just read the letter that Brandon wrote in reply after hearing my letter. So I'll read this now. Dear Brandon. Brandon is a fellow activist and writer and poet, Yonsei as well. Yesterday, blackbirds rose from the high brush near the stone memorial at Poston, while my father flung his arms out, marveling and smiling in the sweet, unseasonal winds. A half moon hung above the circle of palm trees in the morning light. Weathered, folded cranes lay slumped at the base of the memory marker. Is it too soon to be writing this? Is it too late? You once told me about the prisoners in the Department of Justice camp at Fort Missoula, collecting stones and speculating on the ancient rivers and seas that made them. Driving with my father from California through Joshua Tree and on to Arizona, I felt the smallness of the human project against primordial ridgelines and desert seafloor. I felt the seabed and the wild sea. Now I hear my father coughing in the next room in a stranger's house in the warm hour of Phoenix, having visited 2 concentration camps this week and communed. Having driven together in my tiny Honda up rock-strewn acres to the bright stone monument with our 2 guides from the Gila River Indian community. Under the high, white afternoon, over the olive trees and mesquite, we felt the bodies of our elders blooming in the steady heat, rising up, rising and rising. Brandon, maybe we are who we remember ourselves to be. Our precarious lives, an act of resistance, our survival, a rebellion. Our ancestors were here together, said our guides, stolen bodies on stolen lands. So the 4 of us stood in a circle, and the wind stood with us, and memories made us stronger. Tractor rides and bartered pomegranates, koi ponds, talent shows, night shootings, urns. Dear Brandon, Akiko, Mia, Todd, dear Brian, Patricia, Koji, Sean, didn't we dance? Didn't we rise from July's belly, Bon Odori, moving to taiko stomps in the circle of families, learning the shapes of honor early on? We were site-specific and dangerous in our pleasure. We were talk story, breathless laughter, and ancestral rage. Now I hear violins singing in the barrack bones, 80 years on. Creosote overtakes the old foundations. Its healing spines break concrete. Is it possible to send promises backwards? Tell me, Brandon, what do you think? So you can, if you click on the link, you can see what Brandon thought, how he replied to that question.
Yeah. One of the things I really enjoy about your work is the movement between statements and questions. And it really reflects the idea of the quest, a spiritual quest and a literary quest, a cultural quest. And I like how in, several of the poems you read today, you move gracefully back and forth, because the questions are ones that we all ask, and it invites us into the poem. And it also there's a humility to it, because it also admits that we don't always have the answers. And I think all of you today, we hope that the presentation portion of it got you to think about asking those questions, those four, for yourselves. We loved and respected the answers that you put in the chat. And we hope that you continue those remembrances and rituals and ways of empowering yourself beyond today. So what we're going to do now, I'm giving you a forewarning that we're going to stop the screen share. So we're going to be in a Zoom room in a moment. And we're going to hand it off to Joy and Elizabeth, who will, if you have any questions for us, Brynn and I, you can drop them in the chat, or if you feel more comfortable, I think you can raise your hand, because we're a manageable Zoom room today. And we're going to let Joy kind of navigate that for us, but it's pretty informal. So I'm going to stop the share, and we're going to be in a Zoom room. So get ready. We warned you. Okay. So if you have any questions for us, please ask them now. We have about 10 or 15 more minutes before we wrap up, and we'd be happy to talk to you more. So just let us know.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to start with gratitude, and thank you so much for such a thoughtful and wonderful presentation and reading. I so enjoyed just taking it all in and seeing what all the audience and our guests today had to share as well. So I hope that everyone joined me in giving a huge round of applause. I know if we were in person, we'd be able to do that, but also for yourselves for participating. I see some of the little hands from Zoom come up, so thank you. Yes, thank you. So, as Brian mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel welcome to put them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand or just unmute, I just turned that on so you can do that as well to ask. But I'll give it 1 second, but I can also yeah, I guess we can start kind of, I was thinking as you were reading about kind of how you developed the theme for this program, and kind of like, I would love to kind of know how maybe your relationship to these different themes have changed over time, or like come to it, or how the relationship between both of your work has maybe shaped that in any ways, because it was exciting when Brian reached out and he said, I want to bring Brynn into this program. I think your voices complement each other so well, but I know that I'm sure that it's changed over time for you as well as these themes.
Brynn, do you want to take that? Do you want me to take that and then pass it to you, or I'm fine? Okay, so what first comes to mind for me, Joy, is that the movement from my first to second book, right? The first one was so much about trying to understand an ancestral intergenerational history of trauma and silence, and really navigating that, what is it that my grandparents and mother's generation had gone through as Issei and Nisei, and what was the complicated way in which we inherit incarceration and trauma. And so I think that, I felt like I had to write that book before I could write the second book. And then the second book was really about, the stage had been set for these themes of seizure, but what was unknown at that time was the fact that my son would be born with a disability, and how, as a father, I might receive that. So whereas in the first book, I feel like it was about inheriting something that was large and vast and, hard to decipher and figure out and had to be processed. This was about being a father now, and being responsible for someone. And, that's why I read the poem Seas today, because I think it speaks to how it connects the first book to the interests of the second, the focus of the second, and how, disability, race, culture, issues of marginalization are now interconnected. And so I actually see the books as standalone, but also singing together and having hopefully a sort of like a symphonic effect or a polyphonic effect. So I would say, like, as artists, right, we're always trying to advance and not get stale and try to be innovative, but we have our obsessions and we have our histories that we have to honor. So I would say that's the constant, but I think the subject matter evolves naturally through our life experience. And for me, it was the birth of Brendan that really was a, groundbreaking and life-altering moment. And so that centralized the second book. So Brynn, how did it work for you? You're now on your third book, but how do you see it?
Yeah, I was thinking about your question, Joy, of like how our relationship to these themes just shift over time, and hearing some of your response, Brian, and the way that you kind of had to write the past before, and then you're arriving at the present, and this third book, in a way, it's thinking a little bit more into the future, I think, than maybe my first two books, which syncs a little bit with the questions we had today, like that last question, and sort of thinking about art and empowerment and what's next, like how do we act, what do we do, and maybe through my work with Yonsei Memory Project as well, it's a lot of us are thinking about the future. It's like, well, what does the future look like? Well, how do we tell this story to our children? How do we continue to share these stories about camp with the next generation? What is the Gosei and the Rokusei? What are these next generations going to say and do with this legacy and this story? So could just be where I'm at in my life, having like turned 40 recently and starting to like shift the way I'm relating to time, and I'm worried more about looking more like at the next half of my life versus the first part. But the future has just been on my mind a lot, and that's been new. And I think it's been new maybe a little bit in our conversations as well, Brian. And so it's kind of cool. That's a great question. Thanks, Joy. I just saw Patricia's question in the chat as well. And yeah, Brian, I wonder, do you want to?
Yeah, and I can read it out for the folks who don't hear it. And I think it relates really perfectly into what you're talking about futures. And I think that there's been so much conversation, and I love that your poetry both honors like past generation and ancestors as well as future generations. But Patricia asked, do you ever hesitate as a Yonsei or Gosei about writing about camp because we weren't, and in quotes, there? I think that's a really interesting question. So whoever wants to take that one first.
Yeah, I first want to give a shout out to Patty and her incredible work that she's done. And she has an anthology that some of you may already own from Heyday that she did with Lawson Inada that is about the whole camp experience. So you all should pick that up. And anyway, Patty, thank you for being here. Thank you for that question. I think I think that it is an artistic, I don't want to say dilemma. It's not quite a dilemma, but it is a problem, or it's something where we try to seek and explore a way to navigate that delicate territory that Patricia's talking about. So I would say for me, it goes back to the way that I got the story was done with a combination of motivation and respect. There's a combination of seeking and boundaries and understanding those boundaries. And so for me, it was kind of being able to sense when my aunts and uncles had said what they wanted to say and not pushing too hard. And also finding those family members that felt more free about sharing their experience and not judging everyone's relationship to the camp. And then I think in writing it was getting, number one, the facts right? Like we have a responsibility to know the names and dates and camps and get that right. but also not to fall back on cliches or easy ways of writing and talking about it. And so there's signifiers like barbed wire and armed guards and sandstorms. And those are real and authentic, and we can write about them. But what's underneath that? What makes it more specific and authentic to what actually happened? For me, it was stuff like writing about the camp letters that I discovered in the church attic, or writing about a steamer trunk that was a treasure trove of that history, or the temple bell that was in my grandfather's window. So I think, Patty, for me, it was about, number one, letting, insofar as possible, the characters represent their own experiences by describing them accurately and their relationship to the past. And then secondly, it was finding those, T.S. Eliot calls it the objective correlative. So finding those specific images and objects that could help me write about it in a way that was honoring and true to the family history. So I could go on, but those are the main things that come to mind. What do you think, Brynn?
That makes a lot of sense. I think grounding in that specificity and the historical facts that you've learned and the stories that you've heard. And some of the stone poems I've written that are in the Power Me to Swoon book, I didn't read from today, but I didn't read the stone poems today, but that was one way that I think my poetic self was wrestling with that dilemma. I started these poems that were from the point of view of a stone, that I, when we went to visit Manzanar, there were many stones in the desert, and I started imagining, or sort of asking myself, like, what did the stones feel? What would they have said? And through the stones' voices came in all these like stories that I had heard from elders over the years, and a lot of that through Yonsei Memory Project, doing the interviews and with the elders. And so those kind of came through the stones' voice. So it wasn't sort of taking on their voices specifically, but the stones kind of gave me that poetic license to feel into and to imagine, what might the stone have to say. And I realized that was the start of a way. Those were the first poems I wrote about camp. That was the first time I'd ever really taken on like the legacy and the history of what we've inherited, was through those stone poems that kind of came out of nowhere. And I think using a lot of questions in my poems, like you said, Brian, that's kind of a way that I'm also writing into that fact that I wasn't there. What was it like? What can I even know? Like, what did you go through? What happened? And so kind of leaning into the questions as well. Great question. Yeah.
I just wanted to add quickly too, Brynn, that's really helpful and thoughtful. And I think that some of the poems in Topaz, they use questions and dialogues between family members, and it's about the quest, it's about the seeking. And I think Patricia's idea, I think if you're writing about this, it's to really admit that it's a negotiation and exploration and a quest, and to frame the poems as such. You don't have the answers, and it's about seeking out this history and the silences from the other people who've had the experience, and it's about that delicate negotiation. So I think in thinking about it even further, it's framing the quest as it is rather than pretending that you have the answers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to open up to see if there's any last questions from folks. And again, you feel free to put it in the chat, or I'm looking now if anyone wants to just raise their hand or unmute. Feel free also. Share questions, or at this moment, thoughts or gratitude or anything like that as well is welcome.
Yeah, maybe Brian, I'll just add to that, just naming the quest, from the outset of the program today, and then you're talking about that quest again. It's just occurring to me that, because there was the silence, because there was the shame and the silence, and so much of that that swirls around trauma, no matter what kind of trauma you've experienced or what kind of silences exist in your family around trauma, I think that created for me too that desire to know. It's like there was this, it's like there's a silence in the household around this. What's going on? Like just this, almost this existential need to like, what is happening? Like what happened to you? Like I need to know. And the weight of that, I feel like that has also propelled me as well, and keeps me questing. It's like the quest keeps going. And I think about, everything going on in the world, and just so many communities under duress in different ways. And I just think like, wow, this is lifetime and generational work, following these threads and feeling into those silences, and then making art and trying to heal, and trying to heal yourself and each other. And I don't know, as you're talking, it's just striking me that, this quest it's ongoing. And so how do we carry each other in it? How do we find beauty in it? How do we support each other in this quest? Because it's this labor, and can it be a labor of love? I don't know. I'm just riffing. I'm probably going over time now, but I'll just, thank you to Janum for having the space for us to explore these deep questions.
Well, no, thank you. And no, you're not, no, this is all very welcome. So no worries on time at all. And I think that kind of leads into how I would like to just kind of close this off and just know, like, what's next for you on this quest, on this, what themes are you exploring? What questions are you working on right now that you'd like to offer to us as the audience? Or I know you have a book coming out, but we'd love to hear just kind of, what are you looking at in the future now that we can support and follow along?
Well, as we close today, I want to thank all of you for being here with us and holding this space together. And a special thanks to Joy and Elizabeth. We really appreciate all you do. Janum is an amazing organization. All of you should visit and patronize and be connected to Janum. And I'd also like to thank my sister friend Brynn for her amazing work. And I can't wait to hear what her future holds. For me, I'm working on a third book of poems, and it's a bit organic in terms of I haven't pinned down what it is. Like my first two books, it was so clear. I think it's the idea of Dust and Rain is the tentative title. And I think that it is questioning to the future, as Brynn was talking about. What is the future for Brendan as a nonverbal teenager who has a disability, living in this sort of normative circumstances? Will he be with us? How long will he stay with us? We can't imagine him not living with us. Will he ever speak? What will our love look like 5 years, 10 years from now? How will we protect him from the craziness of the world? What else will he teach us? And I think in terms of camp, it's trying to look at it from more of a spiritual standpoint. What is the dust and rain of that experience? What are the fragments of it that remain and radiate around us and around Brendan? And then things like the pandemic and the anti-Asian, things that Brynn talked about, what we're experiencing now. How does that relate to the past? And how do we move out of this space, of the pandemic? And that's the poetry. And then I'm also working on a nonfiction project called Brendan's Garden. And, I think of Brynn's dad's garden, and we have a garden in our backyard that, Brendan walks around, and he used to be in a walker. So he'd sort of skate around his walker, the Brendan 500, like the Indianapolis 500. So it's a series of vignettes and poetic essays that are snapshots of life, days in the life with him. So that's what I'm working on. What about you, Brynn?
Also working with the garden, continuing to work with the garden, gardens and goddesses. I gave myself the task of this winter to just write about gardens and goddesses, kind of as a way to just shift my energy away from thinking about trauma and thinking about some of these heavier themes. But of course, it all came through those, all that stuff sneaks up on you. But yeah, my third book out in fall 2023, a lot of these letter poems, thinking about the pilgrimage with my father, and hopefully some of those garden and goddess poems as well.
Well, I can't wait to read all of this, to experience all of what you're sharing. Again, folks, please, you can purchase both of Brian and Brynn's books right now from the Janum store. So there's the links in the chat, and we hope that you check those out. Thank you so much for your support of the museum. We have a couple other really exciting author programs coming up, just a whole lineup. We're so thrilled to be able to bring all of these authors in. So we have Karen Yamashita will be at Janum for both in person and virtual options. Speaking of wonderful artists, as well as we have a program with Naomi Hirahara and Sarah Kuhn, who are other amazing. So March is just full of full of reading and authors and just so much excitement for us. So thank you for being here. We'll drop some more links for learning more about upcoming programs and how to support Janum through membership or just visiting our exhibitions. I love that you mentioned stones. The suture stones are a huge part of our new exhibition, Bible and Sutra, which explores religion in camps, so specifically looking at Buddhism and Christianity in the camps. And it's just a really powerful exhibition, as well as there's a few more days to visit Mine Okubo's masterpiece, which looks at the art of Citizen 13660. So again, thinking about artists and legacy, Mine Okubo really, I think, grounded it for a lot of us with her wonderful book, Citizen 13660. So please visit the museum virtually or in person. Thank you for joining us today. I'll leave the call open for a few more minutes so that folks can gather links and information from the chat. And to echo Patricia in the chat, thank you, poets. Thank you so much for being here today. And we hope you have a safe and wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Thanks, everyone.
どうもありがとうございました。